7:35 on a very humid Tuesday morning, and it's quite a privilege to have Garland S. Tucker III on the phone. He's a nationally acclaimed author and historian. His new book, Conservative Heroes, profiles several leaders who shaped America from the nation's founding to the modern era. Mr. Tucker, welcome, sir.
Well, thanks very much. Glad to be here.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've pulled it up on the website, Conservative Heroes, 14 leaders who shaped America from Jefferson to Reagan. Why did you decide to write Conservative Heroes, the 14 leaders who shaped America?
Well, there are probably two primary reasons. One was to hopefully bring a little clarity to readers, particularly readers who call themselves conservatives, but maybe haven't thought through too well exactly what that means. And at the outset of the book, I offer 5 foundational principles that I think pretty much all conservatives would agree on. There's certainly some others that could have been added, but I think these 5 are very basic. And then the bulk of the book is involved in tracing the lives of these 14 leaders, starting with Jefferson and winding up at the end of the book with Reagan. And it comes down chronologically through American history, and hopefully we'll show to readers how these basic principles of conservatism really haven't changed. The various issues of the different eras are certainly different, but these 14 leaders were very much committed to the same set of principles. Reagan made a comment early in his second term that I think applies really to all 14 of these leaders. Reagan said, "I'd never really thought of myself as a great man, but rather a man committed to great principles," and I think that applies to all 14 of these men.
Well, there's a prevailing myth that asserts that there's no American conservative tradition, that America has always operated under a liberal consensus, but you argue that conservatism is as old as the Republic itself. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, I would argue really the reverse of that. I think the basics of conservatism were around and very prevalent and evident at the outset of the American Republic, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. I think those initial documents really have the 5 principles very much embedded in them, and liberalism or progressivism as we know it today is a much more recent phenomenon, coming on the scene more in the late 19th century and reaching its high water mark in the early 20th century, mid-20th century. And since then it's been pretty much slugfest between conservatives and liberals, and probably will continue to be so well out into the future.
Yeah. In your book, Conservative Heroes, you outline the basic tenets of American conservatism. What are the most important fundamental principles of American conservatism, and why are they still relevant today, sir?
Well, the 5 that I offer in the book are some basic things like the concept of limited government. A conservative has always said that the roles of government are very few. They're basic and important, but there are not many of them, and the 2 primary goals are to establish order and preserve individual freedom. And beyond that, a conservative would stop and say there really is not an important third function. Conservatives have always known that there was a very strong link between the rights of private property and individual or civil rights. That link is crucial. Conservatives start with what I would call, or called in the book, a realistic view of human nature. Conservatives don't believe human nature is getting progressively better, and they certainly don't believe that government is the agent for perfecting human nature, whereas liberals take the opposite view. And finally, conservatives have always understood that underlying any society, any government, certainly underlying the American government, have been individual virtues held by individuals. These are, and in our case, they're principles in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah, that brings us to our next question. You contend the American Republic was founded not to reform human nature, but rather to establish the boundaries within human nature might flourish. And now let's go ahead and talk about the nation's Judeo-Christian heritage. To me, that's a big factor in our history.
Well, I think really undeniably is. I think anyone, no matter how they feel currently about the Judeo-Christian tradition, would have to agree or admit that if you go back and read the founders, that they were all heavily influenced by that. I mean, there was a variety of religious views, all the way from Orthodox Christians to Orthodox Jews to deists to whatever, but they were all very much influenced by the Christian tradition, and even the deists like Jefferson felt that religion was an undergirding influence that was extremely important and crucial if the American experiment was going to survive.
Now, Conservative Heroes explores the lives and ideas of 14 champions of conservative thought, from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison at the American founding to William F. Buckley Jr. and even Barry Goldwater. We don't hear Barry Goldwater's name much anymore, the 1964 Republican nominee, and Ronald Reagan, of course.
Right.
At the triumph of conservatism in the 80s. What's the common thread that linked these together? We're going across 200 years. And I'm interested to see how we can tie Reagan and Goldwater and Buckley all the way back to James Madison and Thomas Jefferson together.
Well, on that last point, the final chapter in the book focuses on three lives, Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan, and those three lives were very intertwined, and I want to be quick to say that even though the book ends there, I don't think that's the final chapter of conservatism, just happens to be the final chapter of the book. I think there'll be hopefully plenty of other chapters written by someone else on future heroes, but the reason I wrote about the three together is their lives were very intertwined, and I think the result of their lives is very significant. It started with Buckley in 1950 or early 50s, when he graduated from Yale and literally became a national figure almost overnight. And it's interesting to look back. In the early 50s, the intellectual consensus in the U.S. was that liberalism had won the argument. Conservatism was considered dead. It was difficult to find a politician who would admit to being a conservative. And Buckley understood that the American public were really a good bit more conservative than maybe even they realized at that point. And he was determined to become the voice of what he called responsible conservatism. And that's exactly what he did in founding National Review and in his brilliant ability to debate and speak all over the country. He single-handedly demolished the idea that conservatism was outdated or that you couldn't be an intellectual and be a conservative. And as a result of his success out in the marketplace of ideas, if you will, the political implication of that was Goldwater's nomination in 1964 by the Republicans, and it was the first time the Republicans had really nominated somebody who was willing to proclaim himself a conservative since Calvin Coolidge in 1924. And even though Goldwater was soundly defeated by Johnson at the time, liberals were saying, well, that's all we'll ever hear of conservatism again. But
and I want to interject right here because I've got a 1964 Associated Press history book called History the Way We Lived It. And it talks about the Barry Goldwater defeat by Johnson Humphrey. And that was an astounding, basically, Johnson just rolled over. I think Goldwater carried Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia.
Carried 5 states, and Arizona.
And Arizona, yeah.
Carried 5 states. But I think what's important, what that leaves out is, we forget, is that the opinion polls in October of 1963 had Goldwater running ahead of Kennedy. And
before the assassination,
I don't know that he could have beaten Kennedy, but it was going to be a red hot race.
Yeah.
And Kennedy was worried. In fact, that's the reason he went to Texas, was he was worried about whether he could carry Texas if Goldwater was the nominee. And of course, with the assassination, no Republican had any chance of beating Johnson. He was still in the honeymoon period.
Sure.
Kennedy was, was still.
Do you think, though, that the American, and we're getting off the beaten path here a little bit, but I think this is an interesting discussion because had Kennedy not been assassinated in Dallas and put Barry Goldwater in as the nominee, and let's say Kennedy was defeated. What if we had a Republican in 1964 instead of 1968? What if Goldwater carried 64 through the 68 through 72?
There's no question that an awful lot of our entitlements and the growth of government came after Johnson's reign. Kennedy had been very unsuccessful in implementing. Congress had just not gone along with his more progressive measures, and Kennedy's was not really as progressive as Johnson or as liberal. But with that landslide election, which resulted in huge majorities in Congress, and Johnson rammed through many of the things we're trying to deal with today.
Exactly.
Entitlements. But the key thing, and the thing this chapter deals with, is even though the immediate result of 1964 was a devastating defeat for Goldwater and conservatives, it absolutely set Ronald Reagan on the path to becoming governor of California and ultimately president. And you can see the impact of Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan today. I mean, the Republican Party's got 16 candidates running, and every single one of them feels compelled to at least say that he or she is a conservative, and that wasn't the case in 1950. So the impact of those three men has been very significant on not only the Republican Party, but on the country itself.
I want to go back in time now. Was Thomas Jefferson truly a conservative?
Well, that's probably one of the more controversial aspects of the book. The first chapter of the book focuses on Jefferson and Madison, and it focuses very narrowly on the 12-year period before Jefferson was elected president. And during that time, Jefferson and Madison were in the opposition to the Federalists, and during that period, they really developed their ideas on limited government. Now, arguably, once first Jefferson and then Madison were elected president, they became certainly more expansive in their views of the federal government, but they never disavowed their commitment to limited government. And so I think there's no question in my mind you can tie the conservative history back to the founding of the Republic, and I think even though there were other conservatives there, I think Jefferson and Madison in that particular period were very instrumental in laying down the groundwork or the foundation for limited government as a key component of conservatism. So, there's some aspects of Jefferson that are maybe more compatible to modern-day liberalism than Madison, and the Democratic Party, of course, traces its roots back to Jefferson, whereas the Republican Party is a more conservative party today. But when you hear Democrats claim Jefferson today, or liberals, progressives claim Jefferson, they don't talk about his views on limited government, that's for sure.
We're starting to fight the clock. I've got about a minute and a half, and real quick, I want to find out your response on this. Calvin Coolidge is remembered by many as a president who passively presided over the Roaring '20s up to the Depression. What was his contribution to America? And I know you've got to get off the line here in about a minute and a half, so I want to respect your time as well. But your thoughts on Calvin Coolidge? Yeah,
very, very different. Coolidge is not remembered accurately in general by history. He was, I would argue, probably even more so than Reagan, the most successful conservative president. He accomplished a lot of the things Reagan did: tax reform, tax reduction, reducing regulation. But the one thing he did that Reagan wanted to do but was not able to accomplish was that Coolidge actually reduced the size of the federal government during his term. And very much like Reagan, Coolidge was an extremely popular president in his day. The public loved him, the press even liked him, and he left office with a lot of goodwill and had a very successful tenure as president.
We're visiting with Garland S. Tucker III, nationally acclaimed author and historian. His new book, Conservative Heroes, I'll learn to read here in a minute. New book, Conservative Heroes, profiles several leaders who shaped America from our nation's founding to the modern era. You can go to isibooks.org, and you can pick it out there, $22.36, special price today. Mr. Tucker, it's been quite an honor to have you on the show today.
Dale's been great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Time for a break. We'll be right back.